Welcome to the series premiere of Pivot Points, the podcast that explores the expertise of visionary leaders who've unlocked growth through complex pivotal business moments. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal business moments. Our series premiere features the Chief Executive of the Royal Albert Hall, a role which comes with responsibility to uphold its culture, legacy and long-term vision. That responsibility has been a pleasure for James Ainscough, having been a part of the Royal Albert Hall's history for over a decade. The fascinating pivotal moments he shares with us in this week's podcast come from both James's journey and that of the Hall itself. Join me as we break down James's golden balance of creativity and business savvy, his total devotion to collaboration, and why authentic passion is the first step to great leadership. Welcome, James. Delighted you could join us today. And I'd love to start by you just talking a little bit about how you've got an amazing job like CEO of the Royal Albert Hall.
Thanks, David. It's lovely to be here. No, I genuinely pinch myself every day. I think I have the most fun job in the world, which doesn't mean every moment is joyful. There's some hard bits and some dull bits in every job, but no, I'm just really lucky. I think my career has been more of a random walk than a strategic plan. But as a kid, I did lots of music. So I learnt piano and cello kind of classically, as it were, and then at some point in your teens you realize that neither of those two instruments seem to be turning girls' heads, so I picked up the bass guitar and played that in a few bands, and then realized it was possibly something about my looks and my personality that wasn't turning girls' heads. But I made lots of music and I had one of those brains that does music and maths, and there's kind of well proven kind of crossover in the Venn diagram around patterns and sequences, etc., which often make music people decent at numbers. I always knew I was not good enough at music to make it as a pro, and in fact never wanted to be. I wanted music to be joy rather than work, and so I did economics at uni and then trained as an accountant. And what I realized as an accountant is, no offense to all accountants out there who I obviously love as one of their colleagues, but accountancy is pretty dull. And I found that the way to make it interesting was to work for an organization that did something that I found really interesting. So as soon as I qualified, I found myself a job at Warner Music and kind of went through the finance roles there. And I guess if I had a skill other than being vaguely numerate, I think because I'd hung out with musical types for most of my childhood, then working in a creative environment didn't faze me. I think a lot of accountants like structure, they like process, they like order. They like things done on time, and you don't always get that in the creative industries. You get highly creative chaos at times. You get high emotion. You get all sorts of things that aren't normal in every workplace. And to me, they felt normal, and actually quite often made me laugh. So I turned out to be an accountant who could handle the creative industries. And actually, I'm not an accountant who could handle investment banking or other things. So I just found my little niche. And I think a good accountant is somebody who asks lots of questions and actually tries to understand the business rather than the numbers. Because numbers are really just a code to simplify the story of the organization. So a good accountant works out the story of the organization and then makes sure the numbers are telling that story rather than just focusing on the numbers themselves. And so if you have that level of curiosity, and of course, if you work in music and you love music like I did, it's not surprising if you find yourself talking very little about numbers actually and talking a lot about the business. And that then helped me make the move out of finance into initially to be chief operating officer at the Hall. And then I left the Hall and worked as chief executive at a charity called Help Musicians. And then after 5.5 years there, the chief exec job at the Hall came up and I couldn't resist. So I threw my hat in the ring and got lucky. So that I can say that's my career in a nutshell. I've waffled on for ages about it already, but also just the power of smiling, the power of being joyful and encouraging and warm doesn't make me unique. But in the business world, I see two people being serious, and it's not that I don't take things seriously. I take things incredibly seriously in my job, but it's amazing how much you can get people on side and working with you if you create a warm environment. And I guess that's what I try and do as well.
I mean, I've given sort of advice to my children, whether they listen to me or not, I'm never really sure. But one of the things I said to them from a very early age is when you think about your life and your career or whatever it is you choose to do, think about what you love doing and then figure out how to make a living from it. And it sounds like you've exemplified that sort of thought. Is it a hobby, or is it a passion project, or is it a job?
I guess that's a good question. I mean, it's all those things, in the sense that it's a job in the sense that I need one. I didn't come
Yeah,
from the kind of family that meant I have a lifestyle where I don't need to work. So it's definitely a job. It has to be a passion project because, I mean, actually, the act of running a Victorian building as a modern venue is basically an act of sheer insanity. So there's no way you could do it if it wasn't a passion project, and that's not actually just about chief exec. We've got
yeah,
a huge number of staff here who've worked at the hall for more than 10 years, quite a few who've worked here over 20 years. And the hall is one of those places, it's a little bit like a Harry Potter sorting hat, in that you arrive here and the hall tells you whether you're going to love it or not. And so we find that some staff come in and they just don't get it. They don't get how we work, why we work the way we do. And they go off after a year or two kind of scratching their heads saying, what on earth was that? And there's other people who just go, this is my place. This is my culture. This is what I'm passionate about. This is what I feel every day. And I want to be part of it. And then they stay forever. So for me, it is a passion project. And I think proved as well by the fact that I bounced back. I've left once and came back 5.5 years later. Shows it gets under your skin. And it's hard to define what that is. But a lot for me is the variety, both of the role as chief exec, but also actually the variety of the hall. Yeah, we have this huge array of shows on stage, everything from classical like the Proms, all the way through to Cirque du Soleil, and every genre of music in between. And then there's the variety of what operationally what we do. We have discussions around audio and lighting tech for the auditorium, all the way through to discussions about food and wine in the bars and restaurants, from ticketing to HR, from finances to marketing. The breadth of what this little organization does is fascinating. So if you like variety, both musically and kind of operationally, it is a great place to work. So I find the building energizes me. The organization energizes me. Actually, the idea of what the hall is, 153 years old now. Whoever your heroes were, they've been on our stage, from the classic musical heroes, Elgar and Wagner, all the way through to Adele and Stormzy, and actually surprising heroes, Albert Einstein here campaigning against Nazi Germany in the 1930s, Winston Churchill as Prime Minister giving some keynote speeches through the war from our stage, the suffragettes who called the Royal Albert Hall their Temple of Liberty because we hosted more suffragette rallies than any other building in the UK. Whatever it is that kind of motivates you about brilliant British life, it's possibly had some connection with the hall somewhere. And I find that history and that sense of purpose is really energizing as well.
and when you sort of when you think about your career, what one of the things we like to sort of get the guests' thoughts on is those sort of pivotal moments, those decisions that they made that really changed their trajectory, really changed their sort of success, things that they realized about themselves or decisions that they took in the business that they were running. You've achieved a remarkable amount in your career. What sort of pivotal moments come to mind and you think, I took the right path there and I made a good decision? And there must be tons you have to do with the hall. I mean, the hall must be full of pivotal moments. I interviewed Francesca Lagerberg from Baker Tilly. She talked about big dog decisions and little dog decisions. And I sort of really love that. And, it sort of makes the point that, CEOs have to take these very big decisions sometimes, and they set a path for 5 years, 10 years, and you've really got to have a backbone of steel to stay with those decisions sometimes, because not everybody agrees with you from the off. I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts on pivotal moments in your life, your career.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can I start off with just a pivotal moment in the hall's life?
Of
which
course.
has nothing to do with me, but actually it does make you think very hard as a leader. So one thing I find fascinating with the Hall is kind of comparing different phases of its history, and particularly if you compare the 1960s with the 1970s. So in the 1960s, and sorry, this is an exaggeration and a caricature, and I'm sure there was more nuance than this, but basically the 1960s, it was doors wide open, and everybody was welcome at the Hall, and they were very experimental in what they would have. So it was one of only two venues to have the Beatles and the Stones on the same bill on the same night. We had early performances by the likes of Pink Floyd and the Yardbirds and Cream. We had very experimental things like the American Beat Poets doing a kind of multi-hour, I think probably marijuana-driven poetry recital. Yeah, I think in 1968 we had John and Yoko in a bag protesting for peace on the stage. It was like anything goes. The hall was for everybody. Every generation was welcome. The doors were wide open. And then in the 70s, we had different management, and they were much more focused on whether Royal Albert Hall, we have standards, we have a certain kind of establishment air that we want to project. And they started banning lots of things. They banned groups where there were swear words in the lyrics, banned groups that were too loud, banned groups just on the basis that it's not the Royal Albert Hall's kind of thing. They even banned Brian Ferry. And
Whoa.
if you can get that far down the track, that's a lot of banning that's going
I
on.
can't imagine Brian ever swearing.
No, well, he probably swore when he was banned. But sure, you can lead an organisation anyway. They obviously had a clear idea of what their brand was in each of those decades, and what they wanted to do to kind of portray that brand out to the nation. But with a place like the Hall, yeah, we've got a 999-year lease on our land, so we're around for quite a while yet. With a place like the Hall, there are long-term ramifications of decisions you make. And so one of the ramifications of being open in the 60s and closed in the 70s is that when 60s artists really became true legends, you realize by the late 70s, 80s, you realize who those legends are. And Paul McCartney is one, and David Gilmour from Pink Floyd is another, and if Eric Clapton is another one. If I get cautious about naming too many in case I leave somebody out, but those artists, because we backed them very early in their career, they fell in love with the place. They felt that the Hall was a place that could have turned them away but didn't, and they feel that the growth of their career was intertwined with the whole story, and so they kept coming back even when they're big enough to fill stadiums. They come back out of affection, and actually they come back to do their own pivotal moments at the Hall. So we hosted the tribute to Linda McCartney when she sadly passed away, the tribute to George Harrison, big fundraisers like George Martin's fundraiser for Montserrat. So that affection for decades on reverberates around the Hall's brand, and actually, to be brutally honest, reverberates through the Hall's finances as well. Having regular runs with Eric Clapton doing multiple dates is a good thing for any venue's bottom line. The 70s, the artists who grew up in the 70s mostly didn't build the same affection for the Hall because we were close to them. David Bowie never headlined the Royal Albert Hall. He only played here once as the support act for somebody else. Bands like Queen, I think we never gave much of an opportunity to. And so they just didn't have that affection for us. So the reason I'm saying that story is there's pivotal moments where you see the impact of them within a year or two. You can see brand perception shift. You can see the business model work or not work. And actually, there's pivotal moments where you only realize decades later whether they had ultimate positive or negative ramifications on an organization. And one of the things it's therefore made me very conscious of in decision making at the Hall is to take that really, really long-term view. And actually, it's one of the joys of working for a charity that you can normally take the long-term view. And I appreciate some charities are always strapped for cash and are always only a few months away from losing funding. So not every charity can take a long-term view, but we are not in a situation where we have to make a quarterly return to the stock markets or pay an annual dividend to shareholders. We're able to generate a financial return and plow it back into the charity for the long-term good of the Hall and the long-term good of the general public who we serve. And so having the freedom to make every decision, a long-term decision, rather than a short-term decision, is hugely helpful. It actually makes pivot points seem even bigger and even more momentous. And if you can get paralyzed by it, or you can think about long term in the wrong way. You can think about it in terms of legacy, which tends to make it quite egocentric, which I don't like. But if you think about decisions as having long term reverberations on your organization, it does kind of change your focus a bit. But actually, just in terms of my own decision making, I think the big one for me in my career was actually at Help Musicians, and it was the start of the pandemic. So to give you a little bit of the story of Help Musicians, it was founded in 1921 by Edward Elgar, Ralph Vaughan Williams, and a number of other kind of major players in predominantly the classical music world. It was founded to do two things really: to help help emerging musicians grow their careers, and to support professional musicians when times were tough. So over its first 100 years, well, just under 100 years, it built up two core strands of work: one supporting on kind of health and social issues, and the other one on supporting emerging talent, particularly postgrad support for classical musicians and kind of recording supports for rock, pop, jazz musicians. And some great careers were supported early doors by Help Musicians, originally called the Musicians Benevolent Fund, actually, and then renamed about 10 years ago. And the charity was kind of merrily going along doing that important work, doing its bit to help musicians thrive and therefore bring music to the general public. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And what we knew, but I think a lot of people hadn't really clocked, is that the vast majority of musicians are freelancers. So they have no employer, no employment protection. And of course, when every public space closed in March 2020 at the start of the pandemic, they basically lost all their work. And they had no protection. They had no employer behind them. Even later, further down the track, when government introduced things like furlough, furlough was supporting a proportion of salary, and musicians had no salaries. So they went from full diaries to destitute literally overnight. And it was a very rare thing for Help Musicians to be placed in that large crisis zone. We'd previously always thought in terms of multi-year programs, and then individual musicians who are facing crises can plug into our programs. But what we do is kind of steady and stately. And literally the first couple of days of the pandemic, we're all looking around thinking, this is just a disaster for musicians. So the big challenge for us became, can we do something significant to help musicians on financial hardship? And then you're into, well, okay, we've got a clearly defined problem. Freelance musicians right around the country, no money coming in at all, going to be completely destitute. And then actually layer in the biggest problem is month one. So month one is when the rent's due at the end of the month. You knew that government, whatever it was ultimately did, wasn't going to get its act together in month one to sort things out. So you had this situation where potentially thousands and thousands of musicians could be losing their home within a month unless something was done. So we then started working out whether we could build a financial hardship scheme for musicians, recognizing that thousands of them would apply, and we didn't have many staff, so kind of doing it manually wasn't an option. And then you think, well, how can we do it with systems? And if we have systems, what are our bottlenecks? And what kind of solutions have we got? And it was a little bit like, that one of my favorite films is Apollo 13. And there's that moment in the film where the carbon dioxide filter is failing up in the spacecraft, and down on Earth, someone empties out this cardboard box of crud onto a table and says, well, this is all they've got in the spacecraft. We have to create a filter out of this. And there's bits of pipe and an old rag and some gaffer tape and whatever else, and they crack on. For us, it was that kind of moment. It was, well, we've got these bits of systems that do these things, and we've got these people who think in these ways, and can we fit it all together to create a hardship system that can do significant money at significant speed? And can we build it all in a few days? And by focusing on, challenges and bottlenecks, making sure we had the right people in the room, keeping really focused on the need we were trying to meet, we did manage to get up and running. I think it was within about a week. We put some of the charity's reserves in. So we had an initial £5 million fund, and we opened up an automated application process and a semi-automated validity checking process behind the scenes. And because we got going really quickly, and literally thousands of musicians were applying on the first day, then the entire music industry realized that they could help. Because actually there were two problems we were trying to solve. One problem was that musicians needed cash, and the other problem was that most people in music wanted to help, but they didn't know how. And by getting moving quickly, we generated momentum, and then all the major players came to support us. So the BPI, who represents all the major labels, Amazon and Spotify, and many other big brands, they all basically started pouring money into our funnel because they could see that it worked. They could see that we could get funds to musicians in a trustworthy way quickly. And that was an absolutely pivotal moment, not just for the musicians we were trying to support, but actually for the charity as well. Because I think it's fair to say that most of the music industry either hadn't heard of us or didn't really get the point of us, or thought we were, over there in the corner, a bit like Florence Nightingale, mopping the brows of exhausted musicians in the corner of the tent, but having nothing to do with the war on the battlefield. And so what it did was it proved to the music industry that this charity had a purpose and could deliver that purpose effectively. And so it left the charity permanently changed in terms of its stature in the eyes of the music industry, the level of support that it got, and therefore actually the level of support it could offer to musicians in perpetuity. And so now, it had this fledgling mental health support service in 2017. By 2022, we've been able to launch that as a separate sister charity of Help Musicians, spending millions of pounds each year supporting everybody who works in music on mental health. Got major backers like PPL and Christopher Meredith Fund, who are regularly supporting it. And that work on mental health couldn't have been done by Help Musicians at that scale if we hadn't done that initial hardship funding at the beginning of the pandemic. So really those 10 days at the start of the pandemic for us were pivotal for the impact we could have, both short term and long term.
No, I mean, that's an incredible example of sort of leadership, because you could have all sat back and said, we can't do anything. That's when leaders really become leaders, in those moments where you basically grip it and you take decisions and you knock down barriers and you make stuff happen. That's just one of the best examples I've heard for a long time. That's brilliant.
It's very lovely of you to say that. And yeah, and I think as well, yes, leadership is that. It's what was required of me in those early days was a level of impatience, a level of energy, a level of enthusiasm, a level of focus. And that has to come from your chief executive. It has to come from the top. But also, I think it's really important to say that even those really intense pivot points, where it all has to happen really quickly, they have to be done collaboratively. You can't just run 20 miles ahead of everybody else and shout, come on, keep up, guys. Because actually, part of the success of the system was not just we built a system, it's that all our staff had roles in delivering it. We had people who are normally typing minutes in meetings, but they went on the phones to support those musicians who had tech questions or concerns about how it would work, etc. So actually, it was a hugely collaborative effort, not even just with our staff, but we had people coming in from outside to support. And so I think for me, it was a big lesson on how you do dynamic, decisive leadership, but not lose your collaborative nature. Because actually, if I come up with all the plan on my own in my own lockdown home, I then just emailed everybody what it was and snapped my fingers and told them what to do, it would have been a disaster. We made a much better solution because we had the right people around the table, because we had our head of IT there and our head of welfare services, as well as just a slightly impatient and angsty chief exec. And I think that one of the biggest challenges for all leaders is how to be dynamic, decisive, full of leadership, and yet also utterly collaborative and getting the best out of the hive mind that your organization is, because that's where the genius comes from everybody else who's around you.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a high level skill to basically lead and guide and mentor and take people with you and motivate people and get people to understand and want to participate and want to solve and to feel comfortable collaborating. Because a lot of organizations I work with, people feel frightened to speak out. And culture is such an important part of a CEO's role, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the types of culture, but yeah, particularly the Royal Albert Hall, the culture there, that you're creating these amazing experiences, these memorable moments for people every day, every week, every month, and the culture's got to support that. And I'd love your thoughts on sort of how you build a strong culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, culture is everything, isn't it? And I guess a bit like in the way that my career is a random walk. I often feel like the cultures I've worked in have been as much a function of randomness as deliberate leadership. But specifically at the Hall, the culture is all about empowerment. In other words, there's nobody, chief exec or directors or even heads of department, who can be making all decisions all the time. So yeah, we're a 24/7 organization. We have more people working in the building between 5 p.m. and 5 a.m. than we do during normal working hours. So you can't have a command and control economy here. You have to empower staff. That means they have to be confident. And so they have to understand that mistakes need to be addressed, but there's no kind of punishment for giving it your best shot. But most importantly, I think you have to help staff see how what they're doing contributes to the big picture, to the big mission. Because everybody's decisions are better if they're made with half an eye on where you're trying to get to. Because if they don't know where you're trying to get to, then every decision is expedient rather than a decision that kind of invests in where you're trying to go as an organization. And my favorite story, which you can tell in a kind of overly saccharine way, but it's the story, whether true or apocryphal, of the NASA janitor who's sweeping the toilet floors in the NASA building in the mid 60s, and US president's being shown the facilities, and he pops to the loo and he says to the janitor who's mopping the floor, "What do you do?" And the janitor says, "Well, I put men on the moon, sir." And this president comes back and goes over to the generals and bursts out laughing and says, "There's a guy with a mop who thinks he's putting men on the moon." And they say, "No, so he absolutely is. He understands that if any of the astronauts catch any illness in the 6 months prior to blast off, the whole mission can be delayed by up to 2 years. So he understands that a spotless toilet is putting men on the moon." And I think the key at the Royal Albert Hall is to make sure that every member of staff not only understands their job, but understands how their job delivers on our mission. And then they're extra motivated because their job really matters. Their job is moving this great national charity forwards. They're better empowered and informed to make great decisions. And they feel more connected to the organization, to their colleagues, to me as a leader, because they can all suddenly get this sense that we're all pulling in the same direction. We're all trying to aim for the same spot on the horizon. So actually, a lot of culture building then is about being clear with what your vision is, explaining to staff how each one of them contributes to that vision, and then empowering them within their own roles to actually make a difference on that vision. And I'm kind of tempted to say it's as simple as that. Obviously, that I've just described is not always easy, and particularly not on when you're under operational pressure. It's very easy to drop that long-term view and just to make expedient decisions. And sometimes we have to get the show on. But it's my job as chief exec to keep lifting people's heads up to that point on the horizon and keep lifting their spirits up so they understand they're important to delivering that, and then make sure they're just well equipped to crack on with their jobs. And then I can sit back and take it easy.
I think that's every chief executive's dream, but it never quite happens, does it?
No.
If you go back to the purpose of the hall and your original story about the 60s and 70s, how under your leadership are you changing and evolving the purpose of the hall and taking that long-term view? And I know from the conversations we've had over the years, diversity is a big issue in your mind and something that is very important. But I think if we end the podcast just talking about your thinking on the future and the purpose of the hall and how you see the hall sort of meeting the nation's needs, because it is a national icon for sure.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question, and we're still grappling with it at the hall, and certainly particularly grappling with how we present all this in a meaningful way, which is why actually one of the reasons we're working with Brand Pie is because you're so good at helping us take our big intentions and turn them into really decisive, empowering phraseology, which we then kind of drip through everything we do, our comms, internally and externally, everything. So I think one of the things I realized in my time away from the hall when I was at Help Musicians is that when you work at the hall, you love it so much, it becomes this kind of bubble that you work in. And we're over here in Kensington doing our thing, doing what we think is great work. And you forget that no one else realizes what you're doing. And so it's quite easy to be insular in our four walls. I mean, in fact, in our one wall, because we're oval, so there is only one wall. So you kind of go inside and you assume everybody else knows what you're doing, and you assume that the most positive things you do are noticed. And actually, when you step away from the hall, you realize that often they're not. And that just got me on to thinking, well, to what extent really is the hall a force for good in this country, in the music industry specifically, and in this country in general? And to the extent that we are, how are we putting that out there and encouraging other organizations and other people to follow our lead? And to the extent that we're not a force for good, what ought we to be doing to have a bigger impact? And you'd put it another way, how is the world a better place in 5 years' time because the Royal Albert Hall did its thing? And at the heart of it actually is putting on amazing musical moments on our stage. And we believe very much in the power of music to give you an experience that is so unlike anything else, that actually just gathering people at the Royal Albert Hall for life affirming, kind of utterly transformational moments, it is an important thing in itself. But actually, in the way, what's the manner in which we do that? Are we making sure that the array of artists on our stage across the year truly represents everybody in this country, so that everybody could look at our program and dearly wish that for one night in the year, at the very least, that they would be at the Royal Albert Hall? If we want to be truly representative on our stage and our audience to be truly representative of the UK, then our staff needs to be. And so what are we doing on issues around ED&I? And then you think, well, it's not just that. There's lots of reasons why people might not connect with the hall, might not think that the hall is a place for them. Some natural things like accessibility. We're a Victorian building. It wasn't built to be, for example, wheelchair friendly. Curved corridors are particularly not great for people with poor eyesight. So you've got to think about accessibility. You've got to think about sustainability and so on. Even these days, actually, we have to think about the needs of neurodiverse audience members. It's very intimidating to come to the hall at the best of times. If you're neurodiverse, it can be an extra barrier to attending. So the point is, we want to have our doors truly open, truly to everybody, the stage truly for everyone. And I think by doing that and then showing how we do it, talking very humbly about how hard it was and how we're not there yet, but we are trying to go in the right direction. Actually, it might encourage other organizations, other venues to follow suit. We might even build up some skills that we can offer for free to other organizations who want to go down a same path. And in a world that seems ever more kind of fragmented and divided and angry, to be an organization whose business is to bring 5,500 strangers together each evening and turn them into friends. That's what we're doing ultimately in our auditorium, to make sure that we're not doing that for the same people night after night, but actually that is open to everybody. I think that does allow the hall to think that we could be seen as a unifying force for good in a very divided country. And the attractiveness of being that is really, really exciting. And then just go back to the point of leadership. You can play that back to our stewards who are welcoming people at the doors. You can explain to your stewards how important their role is. That first smile, that first interaction, that quick, "Are you okay? Can I help you? Do you know where you'd like to get to?" Those little things, they make all the difference for someone who's never been to the hall before. And so you can have this great big, it's like almost kind of a nebulous ambition to be a unifying force for good in the country. And actually, it comes down to how warmly somebody greets a stranger as they walk through our threshold at showtime. And that again is leadership. You've got to think big, and then you've got to anchor it right back down into individuals' roles. So that's the kind of journey we're on. And the way we're kind of talking about it now is we want to be the home of breathtaking moments and lasting memories for everyone. And that for me has got everything in it. This idea of home, that everyone's welcome, that they truly belong here. Breathtaking moments and lasting memories, capturing this magical essence of what happens when a tribe gathers to hear the music they love. and then this definite assertion that we really are for everyone. I think it's a brilliant phrase. And of course, we didn't come up with it on our own, but it's a little bit of magic that Brand Pi brought to the party for us, having listened to all our discussions on where we were trying to get the whole to.
Thank you. Well, I mean, what a wonderful way to end the conversation. Now, we always end with a little fun fact, and TikTok is one of those phenomenon that has taken over the world, and many people aspire to becoming a TikTok sensation. Now, I understand you became a TikTok sensation without even trying too hard. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how that happened?
Yes, and in fact, it happening then forced me to download TikTok onto my phone and work out how to use it. I'm not much of a social media person, and certainly not of the generation that works with TikTok. But short version of the story, Anna Lapwood is this amazing young female organist who joined our associate artist program with the joint mission between her and us to effectively try and make organ playing and listening to organ music popular with the younger generation, because it felt to us that the organ was seen as a kind of Victorian contraption that gets played at, maybe at weddings and funerals, but other than that, it's not a relevant instrument to most people. But we have an auditorium with one of the world's great organs in it, 9,999 pipes of Victorian power, literally can make the building shake. And we believe that organs can create the most incredible moments. So we worked with Anna, and she has been phenomenal. She's, through her own recitals and also adding organ to bands like Bonobo and Aurora and many others, she's made organ relevant, interesting, fascinating, and in demand in a way that no one else could have done. Anyway, she very sweetly asked me if I would pop down and join her on the organ stool one evening when she was rehearsing, just to talk about the importance of the organ at the Royal Albert Hall. And I play the organ a little bit. I'm not an organist, but I know how to use the pedals, and I can bang out a Christmas carol or two. And I love playing it. So I thought I was being interviewed, and actually she made me play. So I played a verse of, I think it's Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and then she stuck it on TikTok with someone comment along the lines of, "Isn't it wonderful that the literal CEO of the Royal Albert Hall plays the organ?" And it went insane. So I think we've had 2 or 3 million views of that little 1 minute segment. And look, as far as I can tell, that's 2 or 3 million people wasting their time watching me play an organ. They can watch much better organ players than me. But actually, the lovely thing in the comment section is people recognizing that ultimately I may be a bang average organist. If I'm not even bang average, I'm an awful organist. But the hall had a chief exec who loved what the hall did. And at the heart of things, I think that ultimately is where leadership comes from. You have to be passionate, utterly passionate, and full of joy about what your organization does, and desperate for it to do more and reach more people and have more impact and positive influence on the world. That just comes from being a kid in a sweet shop. And I think I'd love to see every chief exec have that level of enthusiasm for their organization, because if you have it, enthusiasm is infectious, and it will kind of drench the organization, and then you have an infectiously excitable workforce who just do the most astonishing things. So I'm not saying that every chief exec needs to play the organ, and in fact they can't come and play ours because it's locked away. But when you're at the top of an organization and you're utterly passionate about what you do, I think that is the start of being a great leader. Everything else then is technique, but you can't fake passion. And those are the comments on TikTok I was most kind of heartwarmed about, that people saw that I wasn't there to show off. If I'd been there to show off at a practice first, they realized I was just someone who had got lucky, landed in the right job, and was grinning from ear to ear. And that the heart of it is possibly what leadership's about.
Brilliant. I mean, I love the thought you can't fake passion, and what a fantastic thought to finish our conversation. And thank you, James, for participating in Pivot Points. I could listen to you for days. That was just brilliant. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
I will. Thank you for having me on, Dave. Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in those pivotal business moments, the moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. And at the same time, check out our latest CEO report. There's lots to read and lots to learn. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.